Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 23rd day of March in the year 2016. It is a Wednesday, and it is a pleasure to be with you here at the Virtual Center once again. We had some production issues yesterday that made it impossible to deliver a program yesterday. So as you know, we haven't been together since Monday, and we won't be together again after today until next Monday. But we have 2 hours before us, and it gives us an opportunity to look at a number of different issues, and concepts and principles and ideas, and hopefully kick them around. And part of that is it seems to me aided incredibly if you are willing to pick up the phone and join us here on the air so that we can talk about some of these concepts and some of these principles. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. 4676, of course, is HORN, H-O-R-N, on your phone keypad. If you would like to communicate your ideas and thoughts directly with me in an email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, lowercase, all one word, at gmail.com. I do encourage you to check out on our Facebook page. As you know, several months ago, we designed a Facebook page for the Virtual Center, and I've taken the opportunity to post a number of opinion pieces on that. In fact, a couple of them I'd like to maybe open our program with today. It deals obviously with this horrendous tragedy in Brussels yesterday. Very, 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 very difficult thing. It's one of those things I'm struck by. Obviously the situation in San Bernardino was a little bit like this, and I'm particularly thinking about the Boston Marathon bombing of a couple of years ago. It's so horrendous, and it disturbs you so much, but at the same time, you can't turn it off. You just feel like you've got to watch it. You've just got to know as much as you can about this, and that's kind of the way I felt yesterday, and I'm kind of guessing that a lot of you did as well. Anyway, I put a couple of pieces on Facebook that really stem from this issue, and those are the pieces that I'd like to maybe introduce today for those of you who haven't had a chance to visit our Facebook page. But let me assure you that what I'm dealing with here, at least from a textual point of view, is on the Facebook page. I've kind of taken to use it almost as an opinion blog, as in a way. And my idea is that my sense is that it gives you, the listeners, the opportunity to react to some of these very opinionated positions on key issues. And I invite you to do that. And again, please feel free, if you are struck by or taken by a particular issue or a particular concept or principle or whatever, and you'd like to discuss it or to express your concerns about it, I would love to hear from you, and I know our listeners would as well. Again, our phone number, area code 304-663-4676. On Monday, as you recall, if you were with us on Monday for our program, our 2-hour program, you know that we were focusing principally on the concept of the principles associated with the development of two-party politics in America. What we were basically focusing on, if you'll recall, was the thinking in the 18th century that created the circumstances which ultimately produced the very unique two-party system that America enjoys now. It's very obvious that in the 18th century, at the time of the Constitution, and indeed for several years after the ratification of the Constitution, the idea of the concept of party was considered to be anathema to a republic. And as we spoke on Monday, these folks, when they used the word party, really meant faction. And what they were saying is the divisiveness of faction poses a tremendous threat to the success and security of a republic. And so therefore, in every way possible, the emergence of or creation of faction, party, needs to be discouraged. Most of the founders were opposed to it. One of the things, however, we considered on Monday was the fact that if you go back to England before American independence, even, when the 13 colonies were indeed colonies, there is a background, or there is a history of the emergence of the idea of what we call, for lack of a better term, the loyal opposition. Henry IV, Bolingbroke, in the 17th century, wrote in his book on the idea of a patriot king the value of what he called a permanent, stable opposition to those in power. It forced those in power to maintain their direction, maintain their sense of honesty and trustworthiness. It kept those in power honest, was what Henry IV argued, among many other things. His point was that as long as those in power knew that there was an alternative party or group keeping their eye on government and watching what was done and how it was done, and more than willing to spread the word around throughout the realm when things weren't going too well, it served to keep the party or the group in power honest. This then is the emergence of the concept or the principle, the idea of a loyal opposition, the value of a loyal opposition to government. In the 18th century, this concept was picked up by the very, very prominent conservative philosopher Edmund Burke. Burke also advocated the benefits or the value of an alternative permanent opposition party. There's absolutely no question. We didn't talk about this that extensively on Monday, but there's absolutely no question that James Madison especially was quite aware of the thinking and the writings of Edmund Burke. There's absolutely no question that Madison was aware of Burke's fondness for the idea of a loyal opposition, of a second party, for purposes of keeping the party in power honest. However, it's important to recognize that this idea of the loyal opposition hadn't really developed all the way to the concept of the two-party system that exists in America. The germ of the idea was there, but the principle was not. The idea of a very amorphous general party that brought in all comers from all different political philosophies and positions in order to generate moderation and promote compromise and negotiation in government. That idea, that concept had not fully materialized or metastasized. That doesn't happen in America until the 19th century. And indeed, we looked at, toward the end of our program on Monday, we looked at a couple of quotations from both Madison and Thomas Jefferson, which indicated that even in the early 19th century, prior to Jefferson's election in 1800, and immediately after Jefferson's election in the first decade of the 19th century, there were serious questions both men had, Madison and Jefferson, about the issue of party. Because in their minds, party signified faction. Madison's system, as designed, as structured in the Constitution of the United States, was designed to blunt and to regulate the violence of faction, if you remember Federalist number 10. And we reviewed this pretty extensively on Monday. I thought that what I might do here as a wind-up and as a lead-in is go back and reiterate a couple of those quotations, because we piled 3 or 4 of them at the end of the program. In 1791, during the debates in Congress over Hamilton's proposal to create a United States Bank, which was a corporation, Madison expressed his opposition to the idea of government-created corporations that were too close to political power. Madison was willing to accept the idea that government could create corporations in order to serve particular aspects of the public interest. But when a corporation came very close to political power, whenever there was the danger that the power and the influence of the corporation could seize political influence as well, Madison was very, very concerned about this. He saw the bank within the United States as bringing together the rich and the powerful, the mercantile interests, and linking them directly with Hamilton's Federalist Party. In other words, he saw power and strength and political advantage to the Federalists coming from the creation of a bank. Hamilton's defense of the bank was clearly based on the public interest. The bank would perform very, very important functions in our society. It was something that all of America would benefit from. That was Hamilton's defense of the creation of the bank. What Madison was afraid of is the political power that went along with that. The extent to which the wealthy and the powerful and the influential would gravitate toward the Republican Party, and the power of wealth and money and influence would use the existence of the corporation in order to extend its own political influence and power within the country. What Madison, of course, is talking about then is the structure of the Federalists as a party. It's very important to recognize, and I think this is very difficult sometimes. If you read Hamilton, if you read Washington, President Washington's farewell address, which we're going to look at, and I think we'll probably get into some of that today, there's no evidence, no indication at all that Hamilton or Washington saw themselves as leaders of a political party. They believed that they were the leaders of what was good and what was right for the American Republic, and that American citizens had an obligation to get in line and support these policies and these programs of their own government. There's no recognition in either Hamilton or Washington of the idea or the legitimacy of any kind of opposition party. But on the other hand, the opponents of the policies being promoted by the Federalists went out of their way to label the Federalists as a party, as a political organization or faction. A political organization or faction that aimed to use its economic power and influence for political advantage. Madison's idea is that when you bring economic power and link it with political power, you literally destroy the republic. You are creating what many political scientists refer to as an oligarchy. If you are familiar with the word oligarchy as it's being used today, you may recognize that Bernie Sanders uses that in many of his campaign speeches and rallies, because he believes that that's really what we've got in this society today, is the 1%, the so-called rich and powerful, are able to use and exert their influence in government over politicians by buying influence and thereby buying political advantage. And this makes it impossible for the 99% to have a fair chance in our society. Madison is making the same case in 1791 against the chartering of the United States Bank. Madison says on the floor of Congress in 1791 during the debates on the bank, a corporate charter, which is what the bank is, creates an artificial person previously not existing in law and confers important civil rights and attributes which could not otherwise be claimed. Madison's concern is that when government creates a corporation, it is creating an artificial person, and it is giving that person, that artificial person, specific privileges and specific rights that other people don't have. A corporation, for example, enjoys what we call, and this is, many of us have probably heard this term, limited liability. In other words, government, in order to encourage the creation of businesses and corporations, passes limited liability legislation. It enables organization and businesses to incorporate in order to shield the company from liability, from being sued should something bad happen. Government's intent is to limit the risk and thereby encourage investors to be willing to invest their money in corporations and businesses. In order to encourage people to invest their money, government feels that it is necessary to minimize the risk that these people take. If they are investing in a no-risk or low-risk enterprise, they're much more inclined to step up and do it. That's the whole idea behind laws of incorporation, is to limit your liability. So if you are sued, you can only be sued for the value of what's in the company. You can't be sued for your own personal assets, your retirement, your home, your car, those kinds of things. In effect, then, the creation of a corporation by government does indeed create an artificial person and gives it advantages and gives that person rights that other people don't have. And so the result is that you see this coming together, this blending of economic influence and political influence to the detriment of the population at large and that concerns that concerns Madison when Hamilton proposes the United States Bank. And then in 1792, in an essay in the National Gazette, September 26, 1792, Madison writes an extended essay entitled A Candid State of Parties. And what he's pointing out is that there really are two political organizations, two parties existed in America in the early 90s. There's one party that represents the best interests of the people at large. But then there's another party, and he basically means the Federalists here, the supporters of Hamilton's program. A party of the rich, wealthy, and influential who are able to link the power of money to political power. And it's creating the age-old threat of linking economic power and political power to the detriment of the population at large. Madison argues in 1792 that this is indeed what has happened to the nation under the new Constitution. This is only 3 years after the Constitution is ratified. Washington is inaugurated in March of 1789. Already, 3 years later, in 1792, Madison is pointing out that what many people believe to be the inevitable is indeed happening in America. The Federalists, Madison argues in his Candid State of Parties, believe that government can be carried on only by the pageantry of rank, the influence of money and emoluments, and the terror of military force. Men of those sentiments, Madison says, must naturally wish to point the measures of government less to the interest of the many than of a few, and less to the reason of the many than to their weaknesses, hoping perhaps in proportion to the ardor of their zeal, that by giving such a turn to the administration, the government itself may by degrees be narrowed into fewer hands and approximated to a hereditary form. They will be induced by the most obvious motives to strengthen themselves with the means of influence, particularly of moneyed, which is the most active and insinuating influence of all, Madison says. Seven years later, in 1799, in January of 1799, the year before Jefferson is elected as president, Madison writes the following in the Aurora General Advertiser. Money in all its shapes is influence. Our moneyed institutions consequently form another great engine of British influence. Our bank is a powerful one. So obviously, Madison is writing after the bank has been approved. And he is saying that the British influence, the influence of British investors in our bank is huge. The moneyed interest in this country is linking up with the moneyed interest in the other country to turn government to the benefit of wealth. Our bank, Madison says, is a powerful one. Their capital belongs in great part to Britons or to proprietors interested in British connections. The proprietors choose the directors. The directors dispense the credits and favors of the banks. Every dependent on these, therefore, is a kind of vassal, owing homage to his pecuniary superiors on pain of bankruptcy and ruin. Say, ye citizens of Philadelphia, have ye not all felt or seen this influence whenever bank directors have been canvassers for votes or subscriptions? In other words, the dangerous connection, the dangerous link between big money and politics. That's exactly what Bernie Sanders is basically focusing his campaign on, is the political link between big money in the society and government. And of course, what Bernie Sanders is pulling big crowds at his rallies about is his promise to basically sever that very dangerous connection. In 1825, and this is quite a bit later, 25 years later, 35 years later, in fact, this is 1 year before Jefferson passes away, he writes in a letter to William B. Giles, after whom Giles County, Virginia, is named, in 1825, perhaps consolidation becomes the fourth chapter of the next book of the Federalists' history. But from their younger recruits, who, having nothing in them of the feelings of the principles of 1776, now look to a single and splendid government of an aristocracy, founded on banking institutions and moneyed-in corporations, under the guise and cloak of their favored branches of manufacturers, navigation, and commerce, riding and ruling over the plundered plowmen and beggared yeomanry. This will be to them a next blessing to the monarchy of their first aim, and perhaps the surest stepping stone to it. So what they are basically talking about then is the danger of linking economic and political power, creating an all-powerful government that is inordinately influenced by those with big money and power. And the next step, Jefferson and Madison both recognize, is the idea of military power. That once you have that link, then the missing element is the standing army. An army that can be used by those in power to quell those who might challenge that power. This is a statement by James Madison, written in 1795. It may be one of the most poignant statements I've ever seen on the issue of war and political power and economic interest. In 1795, 1 year before Washington's farewell address, in what he entitles Political Observations, Madison writes the following: of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the dominion of the few. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied. And all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. The same malignant aspect in republicanism may be traced in the inequality of fortunes and the opportunities of fraud growing out of a state of war, and in the degeneracy of manners and of morals engendered by both. No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continued warfare. unquote. Madison is pointing out that war tends to be the instrument of the powerful. When a nation goes to war, citizens spring to defend the nation, which means they are defending the policies of the wealthy and the powerful. And Madison, as early as 1795, is warning the nation against this. I think this stuff is absolutely so insightful and so valid in this day and age. In other words, the wisdom that's inherent in some of the ideas and some of the concepts that these guys are writing about is just incredible. To think that we miss so much of it. I think it's a shame. I was thumbing through a political science textbook, a book for a 101 class on the Introduction to Political Science, and I ran across this particular book. I ran across a quote in a chapter on democracy and pluralism and elitist views. This is one of the best statements of this link between money and political power and the dangers of it that I've ever seen. This is written by a political scientist in Italy, written in 1939, just prior to World War II, by an Italian political scientist named Gaetano Mosca. It's kind of the same thing that Madison writes in the Federalist Papers, but I think it's so much more direct. There's little doubt or little question as to what Mosca means here. This is what he says, quote, "In all societies, from societies that are very undeveloped and have largely attained the dawnings of civilization, down to the most advanced and powerful societies, two classes of people appear. A class that rules and a class that is ruled. The first class, always the less numerous, the few, performs all of the political functions, monopolizes power, and enjoys the advantages that power brings, whereas the second, the more numerous class, is directed and controlled by the first, in a manner that is now more or less legal, now more or less arbitrary and violent." Basically, what Mosca is saying as a political scientist is what Madison is saying pretty much in the 1790s. It is important to keep in mind, however, and this is important. Madison is writing and speaking in a political context. He is seeking to challenge the legitimacy of the Hamiltonian Federalists and the extent to which Federalist policies and programs have achieved an inordinate influence, Madison believes, on President Washington. In the mind of Madison and Jefferson, President Washington has allowed himself to be manipulated by Hamilton. And Washington's administration is pretty much being dominated by the policies and programs coming out of the Federalist in government, principally through the offices of Alexander Hamilton. So while we become pretty much engaged in Madison's statements, in Madison's quotations, we need to recognize that there's a political context to them as well. Madison is not writing theory. Madison is making a very, very pointed political argument. He is seeking allies. he is seeking to organize opposition to the Federalists. And it's important to recognize that. In the last couple of days, as a result of the horrendous bombings in Brussels yesterday, many of these same issues and many of these same questions have reared their heads, as it were, in terms of dealing with ISIS. Specifically, the extent to which the civilized world is able to counter and to thwart the evil intent of ISIS. There's absolutely no question that the success of ISIS is in large part the product of the realities of organizational complexity in the world, specifically in Europe. One of the questions that I've heard raised numerous times by the pundits in the last 24 hours, why is it that Belgian authorities and French authorities have so much more difficulty in rooting out and finding these terrorists, even when they identify them? This guy that was directly involved in organizing the Paris attacks several months ago has been living in Brussels in the same neighborhood that he grew up in for months. And it was only 4 or 5 days ago that the Belgian government arrested him. There's no question that the ISIS attacks in Brussels were in part, at least, ISIS response to the arrest of this particular terrorist leader. Of course, the thinking is that the sophistication of this particular attack that occurred yesterday was not something that you could plan in a couple of days. The thinking is that the planned attack was there for a long time. But the arrest of this terrorist basically caused those involved in the planning to move the calendar up and do it now in direct retaliation for this arrest. But there's a lot of speculation about what's wrong in Europe. Why is it taking Europe so long to round up these terrorists? If we know who they are, why isn't it possible for them to do something before the act of terrorism takes place? Why does it seem that they're always arresting these people after the event rather than being able to anticipate the event and arrest them before it happens? And indeed, there are a number of comparisons being made between Europe and the United States. Europe seems to have the ability, the United States seems to have the intelligence capability and the ability to intercept, to spot a lot of chatter on the internet and intercept and prevent a lot of these actions before they happen. How many times do we read that the FBI or the CIA or somebody has moved in and arrested the potential perpetrators in a plot that was being developed, and they move in just when they're ready to strike and arrest people and cause it to not happen? I guess the question is, what's the difference? Increasingly, it's becoming clear that the very structure of Europe itself, as opposed to the structure of the United States, is at least in part the answer to this question. The United States, continental United States, not talking necessarily about Hawaii and Alaska here, but the 48 states, contiguous states on this continent, are united under one government. So the borders that divide one state and the other state don't inhibit authorities from chasing down and eavesdropping on terrorists. In other words, the borders between states do not form barriers, do not create problems. But in Europe, they do. Because in Europe, the borders separate sovereign nationalities, sovereign nations, different languages, different traditions, different cultural priorities. And there's no question that the transfer of information, the moving of information related to terrorism from one nation to the other, from one government to the other, is very difficult. ISIS knows no borders. ISIS is here, there, and everywhere. In other words, ISIS is enjoying the advantage of European governments being inhibited from the ability to cooperate and join together and work to retaliate or to combat the efforts of the efforts of ISIS. And the comparisons with the United States are that we don't have those barriers. We don't have those inhibitions, those barriers, if you will, like borders. We know that for a number of years, there's been a move to create more unity within Europe, the so-called EU, the European Union. One of the things that has been tried was the idea that if Europe would adopt a common currency, that would bring the nations of Europe closer together and speed up and make more efficient the degree to which they can cooperate. But as you know right now, Great Britain is making the decision as to whether, in fact, it's going to choose not to become part of the European Union. In fact, that was the major platform plank of the Conservative government in Great Britain. So Europe does not enjoy the unity and the cooperation from that unity that exists in the United States. And ISIS, therefore, is benefiting from that. One of the things that I put on Facebook, which I think is somewhat obvious to me, I think it's instructive, I guess I would say. We spend a lot of time looking at the presidential primaries, most specifically the Republican primary, and the successes, the political successes of Donald Trump in his march towards securing the Republican nomination for President of the United States. And the question that has been raised numerous times is, if there are so many Republicans opposed to Donald Trump, why doesn't it seem possible that these opponents, those people most concerned with Trump, why is it that they can't unify and find a way to stop him? It seems that the answer to that question has been the number of candidates announced candidates for President of the United States in the Republican Party. When the debates first began, the Republican debates first began, there were 17 participants. If you remember, they had to have 2 debates. And the networks decided that they would go by the polls. The 10 with the most, the 10 candidates that the polls indicated had the most support would be in the major televised debate, and those left over would be in the earlier one. And gradually the number of participants began to decrease as one after the other dropped out. The Bobby Jindals and the Patakis and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's absolutely no question that so long as that kind of complexity existed within the Republican Party, there was no way to create a unified effort to block Donald Trump. Translation: Donald Trump was experienced success primarily because those opposed to him couldn't unite or organize against him. In many ways, it's the same situation that exists with ISIS. It's happening now within the Republican Party, now that most of the participants have dropped out of the race, that many of the opponents of Donald Trump seem to be coalescing behind the candidacy of Ted Cruz. Personally, I think that that's a mistake. As much as I'm concerned with Donald Trump, I'm at least as concerned with Ted Cruz, but that's another issue. But the fact of the matter is, many of those who were participants in the process have, some of them very reluctantly, signed on to support Ted Cruz rather. Lindsey Graham, in fact, made the comment that he's holding his nose as he commits to the support of Ted Cruz. And in other words, as the number of participants has gotten smaller, the opposition seems to be coalescing. And it's going to be interesting to see whether it's enough and it's early enough to actually accomplish something in trying to block the nomination of Donald Trump. The question that I raise, wouldn't it be ironic if ISIS, the terrorism posed by ISIS, is the factor that promotes or produces European unity? Nothing else worked, because there were so many things to divide European nations from each other. Their history, their traditions, their cultures, their language, their ethnicity, their economies, their currencies, etc. In other words, there are so many things that made unity difficult on the continent of Europe. And now Europe's paying for that in the face of the challenge produced by ISIS. Wouldn't it be ironic if the threat of terrorism, more than anything else, is the thing that causes or forces Europe ultimately to unite? I'm pulling together a couple of position papers here. These are the things that I mentioned that are on Facebook. Let me share this because I think it pretty much conforms to the theme or to the thesis that I tried, however successfully or unsuccessfully, to explain. As we watched the cleanup after the bombing in Brussels yesterday, we're watching, it seems like almost everybody who's on a panel on television, no matter what channel, no matter what cable network it is, has a solution, has an answer, including the presidential candidates. The presidential candidates, it's very interesting, seem to be walking a very, very careful, choosing their steps very carefully, because they've got to be careful they don't say something that's going to end up costing them support in the elections. One of the people that's been prominent in the last 24 hours after this attack in Brussels is John McCain. John McCain is unlike many of the others in that John McCain has earned his stripes. It seems to me that you really owe John McCain at least a listen, because his background, his experience, the number of times he's been to the Middle East, he knows the people, he knows the culture, he knows military logistics. And so when he basically proposes a strategy to deal with ISIS, you kind of have to at least have to listen to it. I saw John McCain interviewed on television about this situation in Brussels. He made the point that the city of Raqqa in Syria is home base to ISIS. We know that. We know that they're there. We know that that's where their headquarters is. We know that's where their training facilities are. And what we've tried to do is focus primarily on air power to take out portions of ISIS here and there. What McCain proposes is ground troops, what he calls boots on the ground. He said that what we need is 100,000 troops to go into Raqqa and clean ISIS out. He's not talking about American troops. He's talking about an international force. He said maybe as many as 10,000 of the 100,000 could be American troops. The rest would be residents of the region, Saudis, Iraqis, etc. But then the question comes up. If we were to do this, if we were to organize an international force to go into Syria, how would the Russians respond? How would Iran respond? How would the Turks respond? How would the Kurds respond? The issue is that there are so many bottlenecks and so many quagmires associated with trying to process or organize a military effort like this that we can't pull it off. ISIS knows it, and ISIS is benefiting from the fact that there's so much complexity and so much division and so much discord among everybody else that ISIS is able to play one group against the other and really have its way with all of them. It's very much like Trump's control over the presidential primary in the Republican column. There's been so many candidates that the focus of the debates have been on personalities rather than on issues. It doesn't really coalesce into something meaningful. It seems to me then that the issue of unity, as opposed to the question of division, is critical here. If indeed the structural unity of the United States versus the disunity that exists in Europe is, at least in part, the answer to why European officials have so much trouble rooting out ISIS, then that message needs to be taken very seriously here as well as there. It seems to me that once European nations recognize the limitations that they operate under with ISIS, unless they are able to put aside their differences and cooperate, so also the same kind of message, it seems to me, reverberates here in the United States. We are witnessing in the United States unprecedented levels of discord, polarization between our two major parties, dysfunction in government, shutting down government. All of the negative elements of party are rearing their head within this nation. What seems to me is, if you buy this issue of the need for unity and cooperation in order to deal with a terrorist group like ISIS, then we have to find our way around and through the political issues of polarization that threaten to shut down this nation in terms of its effectiveness. More and more, every issue, it seems to me, becomes a political issue. In unison, the Republican leadership has taken issue with President Obama going to Cuba and attending a baseball game in Cuba yesterday. Every single issue seems to have political ramifications. It's used by somebody to its advantage. It's used to attack somebody else. I would suggest to you that the discord and the division and the polarization in our politics threatens to create the same kind of complexity and division in this country that exists in Europe. And in the face of organized terrorism, like we saw yesterday in Brussels, it seems to me absolutely critical that we not let this happen. That we need to find a way to get over and around the polarization and the discourse which threatens to divide our nation and make us dysfunctional. So I think what we're talking about here is the unity of this nation and why that poses a challenge to an organization like ISIS. Our security apparatus, our intelligence agencies seem better able to anticipate the threat of attack. Not totally, obviously. We saw the San Bernardino situation. But generally speaking, there seems to be an advantage to this. What I would like to do in our second hour is begin to look at the early history of this nation when the same question was before our political leaders. The issue of division and discord and localism versus the question of national unity and power under one government. The same controversy over which ratification of the Constitution was fought. Power in the states under the Articles of Confederation versus a national government able to operate on behalf of all the states. That same debate took place in the late 1780s. It's still happening. And I'd like to deal with it a little bit, and more specifically, I'd like to get into at least a couple of the paragraphs and a couple of the arguments in Washington's farewell address as we move into that, and then we begin to look at the issues of parties from the perspective of President Washington. We've just gone beyond the top of our hour. It's two minutes after the hour, 2 minutes after 2 Eastern Daylight Time. We're going to pause for 5 minutes, and then we'll, our regular break. Then we'll be back for our second hour here at the Virtual Center. I hope you'll stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center on this Wednesday. Today is the 23rd day of March in the year 2016. If you are just joining us, welcome to today's program. If you've been with us through the first hour, then I want to thank you for staying with us into this, our second hour. We've been dealing with the issues of efficiency in government. More specifically, we've been dealing with the threats to efficiency and effectiveness posed by division, by polarization, by splits, if you will, between rich and poor. We saw that Madison and Jefferson both in the 1790s used those arguments against the political influence of Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists over President Washington. And what I tried to do later in our first hour is to link the issues of efficiency in government versus the threats of discord and division, and compare it with a response to ISIS. Compare it with a response in the United States to terrorism versus the difficulties that Europe is having in trying to root out some of the leading terrorists associated with ISIS. It's a stretch, but it seems to me the principles associated with these things are very, very real. I would love to hear from you on some of these things, because many of these things are just ideas that I have had, and I'd really like to get some sense as to how these things come across and how you think these issues might help us, or whether in fact they confuse the issues even more. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate directly with me in an email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. And again, I do call your attention to our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to that page and a number of the opinion issues and postings that I've put on Facebook in recent weeks. Two of them within the last 24 hours related to the situation in Europe, the horrendous bombing in Brussels that occurred yesterday morning. Like many of you, I was just mesmerized all day long by the horror that I was seeing on the television. It's horrible. The world we live in is unbelievable. In fact, one of the things I put on Facebook, which I didn't mention in our first hour, was the statement that European leaders made to the extent that we are at war. Not just Belgium, not just Europe, but all of the uncivilized world is at war with ISIS. I think this raises some serious issues and some serious questions, because we know that a major political issue in our society which divides Republicans from Democrats, which divides conservatives from liberals, if you will, is President Obama's policy in dealing with ISIS. And the pressure on the part of conservatives to force the president to declare war on radical Islamic extremism, and the president's reluctance to do that for fear that such a war status or a war situation would cause people to turn on all Muslims. And this would ultimately deteriorate into a religious war, almost a recreation of the Crusades from the Middle Ages, if you will. The war of Christianity versus Islam. And so these are some of the issues that it seems to me we all face. I think this is incredibly important. What I would like to do in this hour is I'd like to go back to the 18th century, and I'd like to look a little bit more carefully at the issues associated with national unity under a national government, as opposed to the separation, the regionalism, and the divisions associated with the Articles of Confederation. If you recall...
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob?
I just thought you'd like to know that you have Horst on the line.
Oh, great. Well, thank you.
Go ahead, Horst.
Thank you, Bob. Horst.
Hey, I'm here. How's it going?
How are you, buddy?
Pretty good, pretty good. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing okay, thank you. I'm trying.
I hope you're getting some relief from that cough. I haven't.
Oh yeah, I do. It's gone. I mean, it seems 3 or 4 times a year I get it, and I can't. Yeah. You know, I just have to find my way to get through it, I guess. But anyway, it's gone and it's fine now. So how have you been?
I'm all right. I'm still adjusting to daylight savings time because we don't have it and you do. So I actually kind of missed the first half hour of your program tonight because I was just not expecting it yet.
Yeah.
So I kind of I missed that, but I did catch most of the first half or the first hour there.
Yeah.
And thought I'd like to talk to you about a couple of those things.
I'd love it.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm not really sure where to start, but well, a big theme obviously here is polarization, and not only. Well, there's polarization in American politics, but at the same time, in the European side of things, you've got like a serious fragmentation problem, mm-hmm. which is not, it's not a basic like left versus right, but it's when you have so many different perspectives that unity,
right.
in my mind, is even a harder reach than it is for us.
Yes,
and
Let me say that the use of the term fragmentation is a good one. That's probably a much better word than the words that I used, because that's what I mean. That's exactly what I mean.
I can't take credit for that. I got that from elsewhere. But
okay.
Yeah, it's out there.
But that word really defines pretty accurately what we're talking about here. Is that right. Europe is fragmented into so many different nations, nationalities, cultures, religions, etc., that it becomes really difficult to cooperate well enough to combat an organized effort like ISIS poses, it seems to me.
Well, and that's the trouble I see is like I can see like the thesis that you're suggesting that perhaps the terrorism threat could be a unifier for the European Union, but I'm kind of more leaning towards the idea that it might actually wreck the entire union more likely than it would to pull them together for like a common defense thing. The reason for this, to my way of thinking, is that it has to do because you don't have fragmentation just in the whole EU as it stands, and there were serious disagreements and drawbacks from the beginning. I mean, like you're talking about England is trying to withdraw now, but honestly, England never fully joined in the first place. They backed out in the beginning to hang on to their own currency,
mm-hmm.
and so they were never really a complete joiner in the first place.
Right.
And the economic burden shifted to Germany, and Germany really, they were struggling with reunifying with East Germany, which also had, that was a severe strain as it was, and I guess being Germans, they they set their minds to it and they pulled it out.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like you've seen how they've exacted their banking practices on poorer countries like Spain and Greece and stuff like that. It's a big tangled mess. But the main thing with fragmentation is like you don't have fragmentation just in the European perspective, but you have just in individual countries in Europe. You have severe fragmentation, and which is, kind of like their style of democracy and parliamentary systems and stuff like that. And, in itself, that's not a bad thing. It's just that it's really hard to build coalitions in that kind of environment.
Yes.
I could see a possibility of like maybe the northern European countries unifying into some separate organization and drawing a line at the southern borders of France and Germany, and maybe cutting everybody off to the south,
right? And
saying we're gonna economically unify, but short of that, and that really doesn't seem all that likely either. I don't know.
Do you think that there's a likelihood or a possibility or even a likelihood that ISIS will present such a challenge that the unity promised in the European Union will just dissipate? It'll just, in other words, what they'll do is throw up their hands and say, we just can't deal with this. I mean, what happens then?
I don't really see that happening. I mean, the thing about the terrorism threat as such is one thing when it's an insurgency inside the country that you've invaded and tried to occupy, like, for instance, Iraq. And when it's homegrown, okay, you can do that. You can have IEDs and you can have all kinds of things that just makes it miserable for the occupying forces to try to stay there. I mean, look at Afghanistan. That's your classic historical example, right?
Right, yes.
How these things happen. But exporting that to outside your own borders gets difficult. I don't think, terrorism abroad is by any, what I think rational definition is just not an existential threat to any country. But it can be politically exploited, as we've seen, to great effect, which is the real danger. I mean, people have been saying, for the last 10, 12 years, America will never be, conquered from enemies outside. The collapse when it comes, or if it does, is going to come from inside. From people just losing their minds essentially, which it looks in a lot of cases like we just might be in the middle of doing.
It might be happening. Yes.
So I don't think ISIS as such. It's just another one of those things. Like, I doubt. In the heart of things, I don't follow this as closely as other people do, but like it seems to be more or less geographically, in a certain region. And then they have, it's like Al Qaeda was 10 years ago, where you have joiners from outside, like, okay, I want to be with these guys, but they're really not part of a central organization like that.
Right.
Right. And even the organization is, where they're the strongest and most concentrated is probably, it doesn't seem to be that tight either.
Yeah.
They just have better equipment, and they actually have, they have trained people and forces and stuff like that. But,
Right. One of the things that I picked up this morning in the coverage of this business in Brussels, which I thought was interesting, they had the video photos of the three bombers with the suitcases on carts going through the airport, and two of them were brothers. Both of them were killed, and the third one got away, and he's the one they're after now. But what is interesting is that the Belgian police, both of these brothers had records. Both of them had been in and out of the system. They were involved in a number of things: fraud, robberies, beatings, or something. In other words, they both had records, and they were not at all affiliated with any religious sense, and there was nothing religious about them. In other words, only when they joined ISIS did religion come into the picture. These are not religious people. These are secular criminals. These are are outsiders to mainstream society. Those we would define as losers. And that's what ISIS is doing, is attracting these people in various Western nations. And so we get back to the issue of the nature of capitalism and the nature of the economy. We're basically creating potential terrorist recruits just in terms of the way our economy is functioning.
Well, not even economically, but I think also culturally. The things like that Donald Trump famously is promoting, and well, the entire Republican Party at this point, where we have to, keep a close eye on those Muslims because they're all, in a block are dangerous to our way of life and everything, and so that makes them second-class citizens and wherever they happen to be living. And this has been a thing in Europe going way back. I mean, like America is just got a sense of this Islamophobia, but for instance, in a country like France, they've been living with this for like 40, 50, I don't even know how many years, decades. Yeah. One of the reasons why, you look at France and you think, why are their politics not more liberal than they are? One of the main drivers for the conservatism in French politics is xenophobia and racism. From a lot of the, for instance, like Africans coming in from colonial areas. Yeah. And a lot of Muslims there, like the people vote the way they do, as conservative as they do, because the conservatives are speaking against, to that xenophobic element. Right. And this exists throughout Europe in a way that we don't even understand in America. Like we're just catching on to the whole game of like, oh boy, we got to watch out for them Islams and stuff, And we're amateurs at this. And
the flow of immigrants into Europe is such a problem. I mean, the borders. I mean, there are immigrants flowing into European countries by the tens of thousands. I mean, how do these nations accommodate these people?
Yeah, with the Syrian, for instance, the what do you call it, that diaspora, I guess. That increases pressure in a system that was already under a certain amount of pressure as it was. I mean, like we've seen, other people that are friends on the Head On Radio network, for instance, have traced in more detail, like how neo-fascism is rising all throughout, the Europe in response to racial tensions and stuff like that. And that was before. That was well before. Mm-hmm. We saw the influx of refugees from Syria, for instance. And that's all these things are going on. The thing is, when people feel a pressure from outside like that, especially when there's a cultural element, and an ethnic thing and a tension like that, yes, we look at Europe, sometimes longingly, from America, as a culture of people who have had, they're kind of grown-ups in a global sort of sense. Like they've been through all this so much more than we have, and they're used to dealing with all these things. But the thing is, it's like again, like I say, the fragmentation. They have their backwards elements too. Mm-hmm. And when you put any system under pressure, it tends to revert to a more conservative stance, a social system. People contract, they withdraw inside themselves, and they tighten up and they make a hard little shell. And when you're looking at not just a left and a right, but a left, right, and a middle, and 17 flavors in between, I mean, what is it? There are over a dozen political parties in Italy alone, right? Something like that, that have some degree of power. I mean, what do those disparate factions do?
I know.
When there is a media and a driven impulse like we are in danger and sound the alarms, emergency, and duck and cover. I mean, when you're under like a threat like that, and Europe has a lot more to worry about than we do.
I know. Do you think that the political and economic realities of the world we live in, both here and in Europe especially, which is creating numbers of outgroups, those that can't fit in or don't fit in, they're creating the population that ISIS is able to recruit in. I mean, you've got people that have nothing to lose, that they basically don't fit, they don't belong, they're not welcome, they don't have a future, and along comes a group like ISIS and gives these people something to fight for, something to live for, something to believe in. It's kind of like gangs in some of our major cities. You know, their recruits are kids on the street that really don't have a future, and nobody seems to care about them, but the gang does, and it becomes a family in a sense, and that's kind of what we're dealing with in a lot of ways. Is for the first time in their lives, many of these people have had something to stand for, something to fight for, or whatever. However crazy it is. I don't know, Horst. Well, I worry about it.
I'm sure there are economic drivers for this, and economic pressures are in themselves. We're familiar with Marxist theory, for instance. It's overwhelming, and it's something that can't be ignored. I don't know about that. I heard 4 or 5 months ago a really interesting interview with not an ambassador, but like some kind of official representative of the Kurdish state to America, and she was talking with somebody, and she said that one of the big things, because the Kurds down in the Turkish area around there have been probably one of the most effective ground forces in fighting and containing the ISIS fighters.
Right.
And we could be doing more to support them, but at the same time we have conflicts because Turkey has problems with Kurds, so we can't really. We're sitting on the fence between those two, and we can't do this,
exactly.
Can't do that. And, but anyway, so like they're and she was making a point. She said, look, a big part of like ISIS's appeal is because they're really appealing not necessarily to the economic losers, but again more to people who feel socially outcast.
Right.
In areas like in London and in France, in places where Muslims there's a distinct flavor of unwelcomeness, like suspicion. Just like we see in the Republican presidential race, it must be terrible to be a Muslim in any major city in America where you're outnumbered and you're out in public and easily identifiable. I mean, but she was saying that, and it's mostly youth, because when you're younger, you tend to look at things as more dramatic and more black and white, and more urgent and more like life and death, just because you do. And when you feel like downcast, downtrodden, scorned, looked upon, and she says, and one of the major things is like the media is doing a horrible job of portraying ISIS as some kind of really overwhelming, powerful force of like this strong, this dark, mysterious. Who are they? How can we beat them? We can't beat them because they're too big for us. And she says, if they would just show some footage of like the people that we capture on the battlefield, crying and saying really dumb stuff, and like obviously like not that not nearly as mysterious and overpowering as she said, that would change overnight. She said the reality on the ground when you're in fighting forces, these people are not that tough, they're not that organized, they're not that unified, but they just somehow this big message gets out, seeps out in the media, and like you got some disaffected teenager or early 20s guy out there that's really just felt like he's not having a fair shake, and maybe working or not able to find a job. There may be economic pressures, the family's been poor, and that I'm sure that plays into it. But like they see like these people, and so there is. I don't know if ISIS as such is a family, but I think people from Western or developed nations that get attracted into that are seeking that kind of a family or some kind of a unity that they're not getting in their own communities because they are feeling rejected. But I think that's more of a social pressure and less economic, although, let's be honest. I mean, if you're economically well off, you don't have to worry about these things to the extent that
but
if you don't.
But what you raise is really important because when you think about what you're saying and the role that the media is playing, the media is creating an entity that seems much more awesome than it really is. And basically what ISIS is doing is tapping into the disenchanted and the those that don't belong anywhere.
And I would add, I just remember like being a youth myself, one of my biggest drivers was a sense of physical insecurity. I mean, like it was just something about growing up, like in in a rough state.
Yeah.
You came from Massachusetts. I came from Oklahoma, and Bob, he's come from the South, and he's raised boys in West Virginia. You're constantly on your guard, and you get this insecurity that's deep driven into you. It's like you want to be like a tough guy. You want to be like a bad dude. And that's one of the things that, for instance, the military, really preys on. It's like, come with us. We're going to teach you how to really handle people. We're going to teach you how to take care of yourself. We're going to make you into a tough guy that don't. Yeah. We're going to make you like a killing machine. Well, ISIS is like, I think they're playing into that pretty, because when you're a young guy and you feel threatened, like you want to feel safe, and you want to be able to be a part of something that's going to protect you. And I think that's also a big driver there.
Oh, yeah. I can remember, this would be in the 70s and 80s, I guess, but do you remember in the 60s, in the 1960s, the big thing in this country, this was during the time of Malcolm X, the degree to which many, primarily African Americans in jail, were turning to Islam, the Nation of Islam. And there was a mosque in Chicago that was kind of, the center of this whole movement. And I was teaching classes in prisons throughout Virginia during that period. And that was one of the things I took out of the experience, was the extent to which, or the numbers of inmates who were flirting with Islam because it offered a sense of belonging that obviously these people didn't even have in their lives. Many of them had no families, no support, etc. And this kind of was something that they obviously were attracted to. And I never knew, I never, at the time, I didn't think about where it might go. But, it seems to me very, very telling in terms of some of the things that you've raised. This particular interview that you mentioned with this woman representing the Kurds, I mean, that's really good stuff. That's really important stuff.
I'll try to dig that up. I'll send you a link in email if I can find it. I know where I found it. It's out there on the web somewhere. I'll try to get it.
I mean, that's really good stuff. Well, this morning I saw an interview. I think it was on Morning Joe on MSNBC with Graham Wood, who's wrote the piece on Islam in the Atlantic last year. Many people focus on that particular piece, and what he's talking about is what ISIS is about, what led to the creation of them, what they want, and his concern is that many of the gut reactions that we're engaging in to the violence of ISIS is playing right into their hands. It's exactly what they want us to do. They want the West to declare war on Islam. I mean, they want this to become a world religious war. That's what they want. And many of the reactions that we're hearing from our leaders in various places are playing right into their hands. They're doing exactly what, and I think I put on Facebook this morning, it's almost like Psychology 101. I mean, we all learned that certain actions produce very predictable results.
Was that this morning or yesterday? Because I read a piece from you, like maybe in the last 24 hours anyway, about how little we apparently have learned since 2003 or 2001, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's so true. I mean, and it's so pathetic. It's like, in 2001 or 2003 we'd already forgotten the lessons of the Vietnam War, which had been at least a few decades before.
Right.
And that was depressing enough, but like we're already getting ready to do it again, and I cannot believe it. It's astonishing how quickly when you pull on that thread on a sweater, it unravels pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
But you mentioned before about a predictable reaction. We can see it in the support of Donald Trump. I mean, a lot of people, I've heard a number of people raise the question, is this situation in Brussels right now, this terrorism event, is this going to help Donald Trump's campaign? Most people conclude, yes, it will, because
Sure.
he's perceived as the tough guy.
Well, he's the person who's pushing the strongest xenophobic line.
Right.
And that's been one of the keys to Trump's success in the Republican primary from the beginning. It's like he was the one who's willing to come out and say exactly in direct language what the GOP have been saying for years, but more euphemistically.
Yeah.
Trump doesn't have time for euphemisms. He's going to come out and just say it, and
Right.
and the people that are ready to hear that message are running right to it because finally, I've posted here and there on the web that I am really often quite irritated by comparisons between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. But I will say that they have one thing for sure in common, is that both of those candidates represent what the core of their parties really want in a candidate. And the Republicans are just that ridiculous. And that's scary, and that mean, and that ignorant.
Yeah.
And they have been building that base because they found a long time ago that if you go for the cheap shot, if you go for emotional manipulation, you're going to win over reason with a significant and reliable subset of the population every time. They found this out with Lee Atwater, and then they got better at it with the Gingrich Revolution. And by the time Frank Luntz and Karl Rove came around, they were getting very scientific about this.
Yeah.
What worries me, one of the biggest things that bother me about the Trump phenomenon is that the future Karl Roves are studying what he's doing right now, and they're taking notes, and they are figuring this stuff out to a science.
Yeah.
We're going to see some really, I don't know. I don't even know how to predict it, but it's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
They're going to be able to wed his success politically with speaking to people who don't really, know anything.
and don't think and really don't think.
And they're going to be able to put that together with more reasonable. They're going to be able, they can take that and build a coalition out of it. Right now, they can't do that. They're extremely, they're limited in what they can do. But
well, one of the things that bothers me about the extent to which the anti-Trump folks are coalescing around Ted Cruz is that Ted Cruz reflects and represents many of the same tendencies, many of the same things. The only thing he's got that Trump doesn't have is the sophistication and the shrewdness, if you will, but he's saying exactly the same things. Yeah, and the training. I mean, he's sharp. I mean,
that's the worst thing. Like Cruz is, to me, is orders of magnitudes worse than Trump.
I believe you're right.
If he is the opponent in the general, well, I have a hard time seeing how we lose to him. But
I don't know.
Beyond his personal negatives,
nobody likes him because nobody trusts him.
There's something about him and his bearing and the way he presents himself that actually psychologically turns people off. There have been articles written about this too. He's just, there's something wrong with him, but he can overcome that. Probably not this cycle, but when he comes back in 10, 12 years, he's going to be dangerous. I don't see it this time.
Well, he's a master at debating. I mean, he was on the debate team at Harvard and very, very successful.
No, rhetorically, he's on point. No question about that. And he's
very shrewd.
He's disciplined, and he's good at that. As far as that goes.
And that's what bothers me. And I think Bob made the comment before we went on the air today. He and I were chatting. He made the point that Cruz scares him more than Trump because Cruz adds sophistication to all the other things that both of them have in common.
Well, he has two things. Cruz has an agenda. Trump really doesn't. If you look at Trump, he's really kind of like a stick figure representation of what Arnold Schwarzenegger was as a California governor.
That's perfect. I do have to just interject for a moment, and then I'll be gone again.
No,
that if any other progressive broadcaster out there dared to suggest that Ted Cruz is a master debater, they wouldn't get away with it. But you, Dr. Bill, you can do that.
I didn't say that. I said master at debating.
Oh,
okay. All right.
No, which is precisely my point.
Yeah, I know. That's okay. That's okay.
I know.
So you-
I know.
so you
I
feel
know.
like-
I know how you work. You parser of words.
So you feel like I got away with something there, huh?
Oh no, that was beautiful. That was a beautiful thing. Okay, I go away now.
I'd like to hang around for a bit, but I would say your mic's a bit hot.
The mic's hot. The mic's cold. The board's dying. You know, it all depends. You know, it all depends on whether I tap the. Oh God, it's a mess.
Okay,
Hey,
all right. I was
Bob,
just gonna
while you're there, let me ask you a question.
Yes.
It relates to the Ted Cruz thing. You made a comment before we went on the air about Ted Cruz. Have you gone any further with that? In other words, in saying that he's politically sophisticated and shrewd. Is there more?
Well, I mean, and he is driven by a religious zeal no less motivating than that which motivates any other fundamentalist. It's fundamentalist versus fundamentalist versus fundamentalist. You know, it's Gertrude Stein. A rose is a rose is a rose. There's not a nickel's worth of difference between Ted Cruz and the religious leader of Iran. Because that's what he wants to be. He wants to be the religious leader of America, and he wants us to all have to buy into. I mean, this is a guy, okay, and I'm not making sport of anyone's faith, except to say that I find it really weird. This is a guy whose daddy, with a bunch of other men huddled around him, put oil on his head and declared him to be the future king of America. I mean, you know, you mentioned Alexander Hamilton a little bit ago, as you know that I'm deeply immersed in this book.
I know you are. Yeah.
And I mean, I didn't really know that George Washington sat down to write his farewell address, and after a couple of drafts, went screw it and handed it over to Alexander Hamilton. And said, "You write
he wrote it.
Yeah.
He wrote it. Yeah, he wrote it.
You know, all that avoid foreign entanglements business. That's Hamilton.
Yeah.
That's not Washington.
Of course it is.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Is that what I missed in the first half hour?
No.
No, that's what you've missed because you haven't read this book yet.
Oh.
Yeah, but I'm going to go into to Washington's farewell address. But that's right; it was written by Hamilton. It's very important to know that.
But can you imagine any of the framers saying that they believed that we needed to have some sort of orthodoxy?
Yeah. Yeah.
Some sort of religious orthodoxy?
Yeah. Oh, this is frightening. I mean, it violates everything that this republic is based upon. Everything. And the public is going along with it. And one of the, Horst made the comment that it's based on the fact that they just don't know any better. They're stupid. But if they're just not thinking, and people are able to play on their fears and stuff. And I guess that's traditionally what's always happened, with people looking to recruit other people, is you play on their fears and their weaknesses and their, and their concerns. That's what ISIS is doing. There's no question. I mean, ISIS is about as religious as we are, really.
But in Cruz's case in particular, he's in a way he's an anti-Lincoln. You know, we've talked at length about how Lincoln reinvigorated the reality of the Declaration of Independence. It had almost fallen into obscurity.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it did.
And Lincoln reinvigorated it for purposes of national unity. Well, Cruz, having been to highfalutin Ivy League law school, as someone once told me, when you go to a little state law school, they teach you how to lawyer within a given state's statutory framework. Mm-hmm. But at the Ivies, they teach you how to think around statutory frameworks. Okay. So in the form of Ted Cruz, we've got a guy who thinks that the 14th Amendment isn't the 14th Amendment. Mm-hmm. Because you can't make the arguments that he makes about, say, marriage equality. You can't stand up in front of people and say that the court has found a right that never existed, when in fact the court's decision was clearly grounded in the right to the equal protection of the laws. which is in the 14th Amendment.
Fifth Amendment, yeah.
And for him to say anything contrary is him saying that he doesn't think the 14th Amendment applies to gay people.
Right. Right.
And so
Okay.
and so he is of his own particular variety. He is a segregationist, and he is an apartheidist.
And he's extremely shrewd.
There's a couple of observations I'd like to throw in here.
Okay.
When you look at a person like Cruz, he's got a certain amount of intellect. I mean, like, say what you will about him, he's got capabilities, and he's been to Ivy League schools, 2 of them. He was at Yale or Princeton. I don't remember as an undergraduate, but one of the 2.
Harvard and Princeton.
Harvard and Princeton.
But he was Harvard. He was Harvard Law, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Harvard Law. He was Princeton first, then Harvard afterward.
Yeah.
And normally you'd think a person like that with a certain intellectual capacity who's received that amount of education probably is not going to be able to hold on to those, extreme fundamentalist beliefs. And but he might be very callous, manipulative or ready to take
cynical?
Advantage of that. Cynical, yeah. He'll take advantage. Like, this is my base. I know how to use this because I've grown up in this group of people, and I know, and they're a major force in American politics, especially since the 70s and 80s. So there's that. But at the same time, Cruz also is pretty unique. You can't qualify unique. He's unique in that he's a uniquely unlikable person who did not make friends anywhere in school.
No.
Everybody that's ever been in prolonged contact with him despises him. So he's also kind of a social outcast figure. So maybe he didn't learn to look at his religious upbringing as something outside of the norm. He may be a real believer.
Yeah.
I mean, I have tended to the idea that he's just he's more cynical. He's just he's exploiting.
That's kind of where I am too.
That's where I have been, but I'm starting to think, he is.
Yeah, but what if he's for real? If he's for real, that makes him even more dangerous.
Well, that's just what's occurred to me just now. Is like he may be so socially inept that he never really got any feedback to think that this stuff is not for real.
Although I don't know if you saw this, and it's one of those things where you sort of hope against hope that it's true. Anonymous has been, well, they've gotten a little bit of a name for not following up, but apparently Anonymous claims to have data information about some really nasty sexual business on Ted Cruz.
Oh, really?
I would be the first to believe that. I've been saying this for a couple of years. Like, that guy's got some skeletons in some closet somewhere that we don't even want to know about. And when those stories break, I don't want to be anywhere near the internet because I don't want to know. But it may be false. And believe me, I hope.
Yeah, but here's the beautiful thing. It's nasty, really. Being as he is a fundamentalist Republican, the what I call the Vitter rule will apply.
They're going to close ranks behind him. It's like
where they say, well, yes, that's true. There may have been that time in Kansas City with a duck, but
indiscretion.
But no. Here's the phrase they use, Horst.
Oh, right.
He's not
still in his 40s.
No, he's not perfect. Just forgiven.
Uh-huh. Hey, this conversation has gone a long way from Ted Cruz, the master debater.
Oh no! Now we're into something. I don't even know where we're going.
I don't know either.
No, I mean I don't think it's really gone that far afield though, because the question is how do and really it will tell us how far gone the Republican Party is. How do rank and file old guard Republicans circle the wagons around a Ted Cruz?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how would Lindsey Graham actually stand out on the hustings and say, and I want you to vote for my good friend, Rafael Eduardo Cruz?
He won't.
You know what?
Well, no, he said he will, Bill. That's the thing.
He did, and he was also the same guy that said if you shot Ted Cruz on the Senate floor, there wouldn't be a witness to
right.
And yeah, if you murdered Ted Cruz, he said if you murdered Ted Cruz in the Senate, and the Senate tried the case, no one would convict.
No one would convict him. Yeah. God, and
just amazing.
So in a sense, I mean, this lack of acceptance that really has kind of dominated his life. He's adjusted to that to the point that he doesn't care what people think about anything. Everything that comes from within him is all that matters.
Well, he probably doesn't even look at other people as actual people.
Well, that's not want of acceptance, Bill. That is that's a deep-seated psychological trait. That's narcissism.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Oh,
yeah.
That's exactly it. That's the thing on his face that I see that turns me off so instinctively.
Of course I got an A+. God favors me because I'm smarter than all of you.
Yeah.
Every time I keep thinking, and this is one of those things I've been trying to put into like a handy phrase, but he always has this expression on his face like his mother's standing right next to him about to pinch his cheek because he's the cutest little Dickens.
Yeah.
He just looks so pleased with himself, with everything that he does. And I think that's the thing that just turns everybody off.
And when he puts his hand over his heart, that's when I get really nauseous.
Oh boy.
Well, when he puts his hand over your heart is when you should put your hand on your wallet.
Yeah, I'm really frightened. I mean, because I agree with you guys. I don't think that Donald Trump is near the threat that he is, and it bothers me that Jeb Bush endorsed Ted Cruz now, as of this morning. And
that's so crazy. I can't even. Well, with Jeb, he's just looking for somebody to notice him at this point.
And Christie, Chris Christie looks absolutely foolish. I
think Christie is looking to avoid prosecution in New Jersey. He like threw his lot in with Trump because he figures he's most likely to win.
My God.
Christie is in real legal trouble.
Boris, I got to tell you, buddy. I mean, we're like 5 minutes from the end of the.
We're getting up there. Yeah.
You made it, buddy. You absolutely did it. You made it again. Well, what time is it there?
It's not so bad this time. It's not even 3 o'clock in the morning yet. So I mean, like.
Oh my God.
Well, no, it gets. It's been bad. Like spring forward is good for me because it gets an hour earlier.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, in the winter, like I wasn't prepared to be available to talk to as much as I have been this year. But I work nights, and this happens to you. So.
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, I sure appreciate you when you do call. It's just great. It's great. But this interview that you talked about with the woman representing the Kurds,
I'll send that to you. I'll look it up. I'll find it. I'll send it to you.
That is because it seems to me that's the kind of thing that people need to know, because that's the only way that you can combat the media's. The media is creating ISIS into something that. Well, obviously, what you're saying, she suggests, is not real. That we're creating, an entity that really doesn't exist.
Well, and the law of unintended consequences is at work here as well too. And the best example for that is the PLO and Hamas. The Israelis hated the PLO, so they did everything they could to suppress the PLO, including the creation of Hamas.
Yeah.
And now they've got Hamas, and they're looking back on the good old days of the PLO.
Yeah.
Well, the same thing, we created a Frankenstein monster called Al-Qaeda.
Mm-hmm. This goes back to the Balfour Declaration.
Well, sure it does.
Yeah.
This has been like our basic, foreign policy.
Well, and the Sykes-Picot Treaty.
Right. Sure. Well, we divided these areas up, and the arrogance that we operated under is just incredible. We're paying the price for it, guys. We're paying.
Well, Sykes and Picot, you look at a map of the Middle East. Sykes and Picot just sat down with a map and a straight edge.
Yeah.
And they were white Europeans. They couldn't be bothered to consider things like geography or tribal allegiances. We'll just we'll pinch off a little bit of this and put it over here. And
yeah.
And Syria's got to have a seaport, so Lebanon can't go all the way up to the Turkish border. And
yeah, I'll tell you, Bob. No, it's really funny when you study those things in textbooks. It's amazing. And this is the stuff that people don't know, and this is the stuff that many officials don't want people to know, is this kind of background. And well,
right.
I got to tell you, I got a lot to think about when we get off the air here today. Let me tell you.
Well, I'm gonna close my mic. It's been a dandy good program, Dr. Bill. Thanks, Horst.
Thanks, buddy. Horst, thank you, my friend.
Yeah, I got to do it too. I'll bow out and I'll let you get back to it. So,
sleep tight.
Shall do.
Okay,
Catch
buddy.
you next time.
Thank you. Okay, I appreciate it so much. Thank you, Bob. Again, thank you for your contributions. It's just great. We're at 58 minutes after the hour, and it's almost too late to get into anything new. Let me suggest that next week on Monday, barring another Brussels or something like that, I would like to get into Washington's farewell address. And I mentioned this before. If you have an opportunity between now and Monday to go online and look at Washington's farewell address, 1796, we'll be spending a couple of days on it. It's so rich. It's rich in foreign policy. It's rich in what we were talking about today. It's rich in the whole issue of political parties versus factions and all the rest of it. I think it's absolutely one of these critical documents. And the fact that, as we learned today, it was drafted not by George Washington, but by Alexander Hamilton, I think is very, very significant in terms of what was happening at that time politically. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Horst for calling in, Bob for joining in. Mostly, I want to thank you all for listening. I hope that you'll be able to join us again next Monday at the Virtual Center. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful week. This coming Sunday is Easter Sunday, and I hope that many of you have an enjoyable, wonderful week. And we'll get together again the first of next week. Thank you so very much. This is Bill O'Brien. Thanks for listening. Be kind to each other, especially in this world we live in. Be especially kind to each other. And thank you.